Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not a stranger to South Africa. I've been coming to South Africa for over 20 years, and some of your high officials have been my students. That's how old I am. But it's a great pleasure. 40 years ago, I decided that two countries besides my original country of origin in Europe were interesting, and that was China and South Africa. And I was not wrong in my vision of the interesting or the countries that were very important. The topic, and I thank you for the wonderful introduction, the topic is very crucial, growth. And as the Dean clearly indicated, where the problem is unemployment, especially youth unemployment. And of course, the way to solve that is by growth. And so we look at growth, particularly as it is related to South Africa. Would you, the next slide? Yeah. So what I will do is begin with the global financial crisis and South Africa, because the crisis is not over, and we want to know why growth is so slow in South Africa. It is still the outcome or the remnants of the global financial crisis, or there is something underlying or more fundamental than that, because that will determine the policies that are best useful to stimulate growth. Then we go South Africa and the BRICS. As you know, South Africa has become part of this 5 nations association, besides being the G20. The major challenges facing South Africa today, and what are the characteristics? Why some countries are growing very rapidly? South Africa is not among them. We want to know why and how to change that situation. Africa, until 10 years ago, was regarded almost hopeless. Of course, South Africa is in a different category, but 6 of the top 10 fastest growing countries in the world are now in sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa is not one of them. Of course, it's very easy to grow when you start from a very, very low level, which is not the situation of South Africa. And then the growth factors. You see, it would be very easy to come here to grow, you have to invest more. But one has to understand what are the forces that lead to growth, and what is it that is holding back South Africa, how much effort and where the effort is necessary. Otherwise, people can come and say platitudes, we need to invest more, but what are the bottlenecks to growth? We had years back Joe Stiglitz coming to South Africa. He knows nothing about South Africa, and he pontificates saying things which are, some of them completely useless and some even dangerous, and so we have to be very careful. And then how to speed, how to do it. On my way here, I was in Europe, and in France and Italy, I was told by the Minister of Finance, can you give us a list of 7 or 8 things that we can do quickly and have immediate results? Well, you go to the pharmacy for that. But you do not solve problems which are created in the course of 20, 30 years in 6 months. Of course, you have to begin, but there is... so why don't the next? So first, as I said, why still talk about the crisis? One, South Africa was heavily affected by the crisis, and we want to know how much the remnant of that is the cause of slow growth in South Africa. Then we have to do things which are useful. There is a gentleman going around the world, Nouriel Roubini, who says he has predicted the crisis. Well, if he really did, we want to listen, because we want to learn, we want to avoid another crisis, and we want to know how to come out of the crisis. But in front of 1,000 people in Washington, D.C., I told them, Nouriel Roubini, you predicted nothing. If I'm wrong, you tell me, and I will stop saying it and stop writing about it. And it's not a question of being unkind to people. We are here to learn. We are not here to talk nonsense. If you predicted something, we want to listen to you. Otherwise, we have no reason to listen to you. To make a prediction, you must tell me 2 things. 1, when a crisis will come, and 2, what is the cause of the crisis. You cannot tell me we are going to have a crisis. As night follows day, we will always have crises, but you have to tell me when and why. And if you miss one or the other, you told me nothing. Okay? Now, in 2004, you said the global financial crisis was imminent. Now, in my dictionary, imminent doesn't mean necessarily today, this week, but soon, within a month, 6 months. And the reason was that the dollar would collapse. Something that was possible then, something possible now, but it's not the cause of the crisis. Then in 2006, you repeated that a global financial crisis was also imminent, this time because of the flaring up of the price of primary commodities, particularly petroleum. But that crisis didn't come. Then in 2007, you said a global financial crisis has come. It will probably begin in the US housing sector because of a bubble. But frankly, in 2007, we all knew. If a week ago I had said in Johannesburg today it will rain, and then 3 days ago I would have said it's going to be cloudy. And last night I looked at the sky, it was clear, and I made a perfect prediction that today would be sunny. So, Nuriel Rubini, you predicted nothing. Because in order to do appropriate economic analysis, you need 3 things. Number one, a deep knowledge of theory. Theory is like the GPS. Theory tells you the direction. If you do not know theory, it's like entering a dark classroom, a dark hole, and looking for the switch. Without theory, sometimes you can say useful things, but you don't know. Other times, you don't find the switch right away to put on the light, and you say things that sound to you useful, but they are completely wrong. So you do need theory. Secondly, you need to know knowledge of the real world, because very often the real world does not operate as theory postulates. When you have a recession, you want to have easy monetary policy, lower interest rates. But in today's world, interest rates in advanced countries are practically zero. And they do not do their job to stimulate the economy. So here is a situation where the real world tells us that the theory has to adjust to the situation, the current situation. So you need knowledge of the real world. And thirdly, you do need a little common sense. You know, there are people who are pessimists. I mean, we want to be a bit optimistic about things. We don't want to be unrealistically optimistic, but there are people who are pessimists. They never smile. We stay away from those people because they spread gloom. But I have a different definition of an optimist, of a pessimist. And it's my definition. I take credit for that. To my mind, the optimist is not, the pessimist is not someone who always sees crises coming. The true pessimist is one who always predicts crises, fine, but then when the crisis does not come, instead of being happy to be wrong that we don't have a crisis, they become even more unhappy because they thrive on. Now, Rubini is called Dr. Doom. He made news in the Wall Street Journal by cracking a little smile. I mean, we, as I said, we are here to learn, and we have nothing to learn, and it's not being negative. We are here to learn. If you go out of here and you know nothing useful any more than before you came, we just wasted time. Not just my time, your time. You know, you want to, and so we have to do useful things. Now, we know the causes, and again, we go back, we hope to get out. The causes are quick to go over. The banks in the United States gave mortgages to families and individuals when interest rates were the lowest, were variable, and the lowest in 50 years. But to individuals who even under those conditions could not manage the mortgage, they would probably not be able to pay the payments or to make the payments. So the question is, why do those banks give mortgages to people that they knew would not be able to manage? Because they also knew, these banks, that they would sell these instruments, these mortgages, to investment banks. And why would investment banks buy these mortgages that were dangerous? Because they would then repackage these mortgages together with other financial instruments and then sell them all over the market, and by so doing they thought somehow the risk would disappear or be minimized. And then why do individuals and companies buy these financial instruments, securitization of these companies? Because they had distinguished names, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch at the time, and so on, and because these companies had AAA ratings. So now these were instruments of well-known companies with AAA ratings, the highest rating for quality and not excessive risk-taking. Now, how did they get these AAA ratings? Because the rating agencies gave it to them, but this is collusion. The rating agencies are paid by the banks they are to rate. And so there is collusion. If you don't give me AAA rating, I go to your competitor. And so they got AAA ratings. And then we had the Security and Exchange Commission, the commission that was supposed to oversee that banks and financial corporations do not take unnecessary and dangerous risks. Well, when the head of this Security and Exchange Commission testified in front of Congress, you could tell that he was completely incompetent. He was asleep at the wheel. And so, now, if you have people who are not economists and you were to explain in different words why the crisis came, there are 4 reasons, less technical, but 4 reasons. Number 1, there were inadequate regulations in the financial sector. Now, the commercial banks were well regulated, but the investment banks were not. Now, commercial banks are the poor cousins of the banking sector. They deal with deposits, little loans, and so on. The investment banks are the rich cousins, the ones who make millions of billions of dollars of profits. It is from there that the crisis came, and that was the sector that was not well regulated. So, the first reason, inadequate regulations. The second, the regulations that existed were not applied. The third, poor ethics. Little ethics in the sense of profits at all costs. Things that were not necessarily illegal, but are unethical. And fourthly, really fraud. Now, you all heard of this management of a fund, Madoff in New York, who made, single-handedly, disappear $64 billion. It was a Ponzi scheme. And what is $64 billion? 2 months ago I was in Serbia, a country of 8 million people, and not the poorest of countries. The GDP, the total value of goods and services of Serbia, was $44 billion. So now Madoff made one Serbia and a half disappear. I mean, that's how dangerous these things are. So, but now Europe, I have another leg in Europe. I go to Europe all the time. I stopped on the way here, and I will stop on the way back. Said to the United States, you see what you caused? Yes, the crisis started in the United States. But I tell Europeans, if you, European countries and banks, had not committed even more excesses than American banks and institutions, you would not have gotten the crisis. And in fact, I'm surprised it didn't come to you first. And look at what Europeans have done. One way to measure risk is leverage. Leverage, as you know, is an index that goes from 0 to 100. It measures risk. A 0 leverage means no possibility of a crisis. 100, for surely you get into a crisis. Now, when Lehman Brothers, which started the crisis, went out of business, the leverage was 31, from 0 to 100. The second, the largest American bank, which was weak, was Citigroup, was 38. But UBS, Swiss, the risk was 42, the leverage. Deutsche Bank was 56, and Barclays British Barclays, 63. I was a consultant to Deutsche Bank, and they said the leverage was 25. I said, how did you measure it? They only measured the risk in their commercial banking sector. Well, by the time we got finished, it was 56. The weighted average leverage for the 12 largest American banks is 20. For Europeans was 35. So Europeans committed even more excesses than Americans. Then we look at the housing bubble. Now it's difficult to see, but at the bottom, I'm looking for my pointer. Well, I don't have the pointer. No, I should have it. Yes. This is 1987, and this is the long-run trend in housing. This is housing prices in Ireland. This is in the UK. This is in Spain, and this is the US. So now, there was a housing bubble, bigger in many European countries than in the United States, and so the crisis came, and when it came quickly because the financial sector works quickly. It came in Europe within 6 months, and the next, we see what happens next. This is the loss of GDP, the recession in the United States. This is the recession in the euro area. I'm not surprised it came deeper. In the United States, there was a recovery. Within a year or slightly above a year, they recovered all of the lost output. In Europe, they never recovered, and in fact, they got back into recession again. And now the prospects of growth are half or less than half. So Europe has other problems. I come here, as I was saying to the dean, I gave lectures last week. This week, 8 lectures, not all the same, very different. It's, so, and in Europe, I gave a lecture. When and how will the euro crisis end? And that's another matter for another time, another place. So we go on. Now, after this, the crisis came to emerging markets, including South Africa. But this time, emerging markets were not at fault. They did not do anything that they deserved to be like Europe, to be in a recession. It's not like 1997 in Thailand and Southeast Asia, where they had their own excesses, and that was the cause of the crisis. So how did the crisis come to emerging markets and South Africa? Through 2 channels in the real sector of the economy. With a lag, because the real sector doesn't operate like the financial sector at the press of a keyboard at the computer. So this is the decline in world output. World output, at the depth of the recession, the first quarter of 2009, world output declined by about 2%, but this is the decline in world trade, over 9%. So now world trade declined, the advanced countries were in a recession, they demanded few of the exports of emerging markets, and that's how the crisis came to emerging markets, one of the avenues. When your exports go down, the level of GDP goes down by a multiple of that. There is a multiplier effect, and this is one way. The other way is financial flows to emerging markets. Now, this is from advanced to emerging markets. Of course, in 2006, there was the flows, financial and foreign direct investments from advanced to emerging markets was about $300 billion. There was a flare-up in 2007 in the bubble, part of the bubble. But then when the bubble burst, the financial flows from advanced to emerging markets became 2/3 of before, 200 billion rather than 300 billion. So now the crisis comes, and we see what happens. China is, the crisis came by a reduction in growth rates, and so in India. In the other of the BRICS, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa, it came deeper, was really a recession. And then this is what I began with. There was a recovery, it seemed, but then this recovery petered out. And so the question is, are we still fighting the remnants of the recession, which requires some policies? That's why yesterday I was at the National Treasury. Or is this a structural problem requiring different types of policies? You see, if you have pneumonia, you cure pneumonia with antibiotics. If you no longer have pneumonia, antibiotics will not help. If you have circulatory problems, you need different policies. So it's crucial for the government to know what is. Now, the one thing, a little, because we don't have that much time, but one thing to look at China. People say data speak for themselves. Data do not speak for themselves. We must understand what they are telling us. First of all, a growth of 10% per year means that the real GDP doubles every 7 years. Now the growth is 7%, so it takes 10 years to double, but it's still a huge, high rate of growth. However, for China, first of all, if I said 2 years ago, which I did, the growth of China will go down to 7% from 10, 12%, it would be shocking. And I'm telling you now that within 2 or 3 years, the growth rate in China will be 4 or 5%. Still very high, but shockingly seeming. But I say things with a little confidence. I don't have a crystal ball, but I was right most of the time. So I have that to my certainty or sureness in mentioning this. Now, how do you interpret these growth rates? I'll say something I said this to a meeting of all the governors of central banks. At one point, the governor of the Central Bank of Argentina said, you know, I never really thought of that, which means people do not interpret China. A growth rate of 6% is like 0% for Germany. An emerging market that is still 300-400 million. Let's not forget the great power. China has 400 million people who still live in subsistence agriculture. And they need 5-6 percentage points of growth simply to transfer into the market economy. So for China, less than 6% is dangerous, very dangerous, and the government knows. I'm part of the MBA also in China, and the top program MBA in China. And until 5 years ago, every graduate had waiting upon graduation 3 or 4 jobs. Now you have 3 graduates going after 1 job available. And you know, people who make sacrifices expect to get a return for their sacrifices. And now they live in crammed, they live 3-4 people in a 1-room apartment in Beijing and Shanghai waiting for a job. Those people are not peaceful. You know, you need to provide opportunities for them. The government knows. Now India was a special case because it seemed embarrassing for us that China, which opened up economically, but is still not a democracy, grows, and India, the largest democracy in the world, does not grow. It seemed almost to imply that you need some kind of dictatorship, and so now we are delighted that India found a way to grow rapidly. Before India grew rapidly, when the monsoon, the rains came, when agriculture did well, and not well when the monsoon did not come. Now India found a way for continuous rapid growth, and we are delighted. But we are particularly concerned about these growth rates. So for South Africa, growth rate of 1.9, 2.3, 2.7 is not only completely inadequate, but if that was the only thing that would be possible, then we have to live with it. But it's not. South Africa has the potential to grow 5, 6, 7% per year. If it did not have the potential, then it would be wishful thinking. So the question is how to go to that rate of growth, and we know, you don't need me to come, that South Africa needs 5, 6% for 10, 20 years to overcome the problem that is the issue. South Africa not only has an unemployment, but a youth unemployment problem, which is and the only way to resolve that, you could take palliatives, give a little subsidy to unemployed youth. No, what we need is to create jobs that it brings dignity. No people, I mean, when you are 30 years old and you do not have a job, you didn't have a job, have no expectation of having a job, the temptation, the desperation drives people to do. The best way to resolve many of the social ills is growth and jobs. Okay? And this is not easy, of course, but we'll have to see. We can go on. Now, this is the growth rate expected for developing Asia, which includes China, which grows rapidly, in India, but this is sub-Saharan Africa, okay? This is growth rates expected about 6%. These are the advanced countries, and these are bunched together, the other, Central and Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. So sub-Saharan Africa, including South Africa, is here, but of course these growth rates come primarily from the poorest country, which are now happen to grow. We will see which they are and why in a moment. So now we look at South Africa in the BRICS. And of course, we cannot be shocked. We know that the population of China, India, and so on, South Africa is the smallest of these of the BRICS. In fact, there are people who say, why is South Africa in the BRICS? There are Indonesia, which is a bigger economy, that should be there. Korea should be there. Turkey should be there. But South Africa is the most important country and the best, most developed, the richest economy in the entire African continent. And so it is, you want an African nation representative here. And it's, that is not Nigeria. And I don't say this because we're in South Africa. Nigeria is a long way to go for reasons that we will see. So South Africa is there, the GDP, and notice the per capita income. Russia comes primarily from primary commodities. I understand South Africa in 1970 had a huge gold production, huge, but unfortunately at that time, gold was priced at $35 per ounce. Imagine if South Africa would have that kind of production now, when the price of gold is not 10 times, but now the price of gold is $1,300 as opposed to 35. Now divide $1,200 or 300 by 35, and you see how much more South Africa would have earned. Unfortunately, the richest veins have been exploited, and now South Africa's production is not even a quarter of what it used to be there. So that's where Russia income comes from. But South Africa is closer in a sense to Brazil. And notice, Brazil has the same potential, if even more than South Africa, and also not growing rapidly. We want to understand why, and therefore what can be done to overcome this. This is now the value of real GDP in South Africa. It's less because this is a previous date, but it's less. But this was the total value, the economy, the size of the economy of Nigeria before the World Bank decided to revalue. Said, oops, we made a mistake in measurement, and from one day to the next, they changed a little. But when revisions are so dramatic, you begin to not to have faith and confidence in these values. But even if this were the case, Nigeria, of course, has almost 200 million population, South Africa 52, so the per capita income is still 4 times higher in South Africa than in Nigeria. But now let's come closer to South Africa to see where South Africa stands. Exports are useful because they create also jobs, okay, and allow us to be able to import. But notice, the growth was going up to 2008, then we had the recession, then we seem to have a recovery, but not much of a recovery because these are now nominal. In nominal terms, we have inflation. So if you measure these at constant prices, it would be no more than 70 billion. So exports are not growing very rapidly as much as necessary. Then CA is the current account. The current account is the balance, how much we export as opposed to how much we import. Now, an emerging market, it's natural that they have a deficit in the current account, that they import more than they export because they need to import machinery, a lot of things that they do not do. But that is usually balanced by a financial account which is positive. Instead, we have a financial account which is also negative. In other words, in all emerging markets and growing economies, at the beginning, not as a cycle, but as a secular situation, they have a trade deficit balanced by capital inflows. Now, first of all, is this deficit dangerous? Well, there is no specific measure that tells you, but we have done, and other people have done studies indicating that when this ratio becomes more than 3-4%, there is a danger, that is, you are exceeding what is the norm, and that could lead to future problems, but not too far off. But this negative here is a problem. Why is it negative? For 2 reasons. First of all, we want to attract foreign capital, but now we are competing with other nations in attracting foreign capital. Other nations that may be willing to give more benefits, tax holidays, you don't pay taxes, subsidies, to set up the firm. And the more of these subsidies you give, of course, the less the remaining negative, the net benefit that you get. So in a sense, you're in competition. And in all frankness, the labor relations are beginning to worry foreign investors. BMW was supposed to build a new integrated plant that would have given 5,000 new jobs, and of course, not just those, then you have the secondary effects of jobs. And they looked at what's happening in the labor relations in the mining and so on, and they decided not to come. So perception outside is important. So one is the competition with, if you have to give benefits that remove most, to attract foreign investments, that they take most of the remaining benefits that you expect to get, then there is no reason, so that's one way why not so many capitals come. And then the danger, they fear I mean, the news are full of the demonstrations, the strikes in the mining sector, and they feel now South Africa is one positive thing, the rule of law, regulations, which no other African country has. The banking sector is very sound. So there are very many positive things, but we would like to see this positive rather than negative, and it was negative all the time, to balance that and more. The rand, of course, depreciated. This is the number of rands you need to buy a dollar. But depreciation sometimes is necessary in order to become competitive on world markets. So that's no problem. The rate of inflation, what is appropriate? For developed, advanced countries, they cannot go more than 2%, because then it becomes dangerous. For an emerging markets, 4 or 5% is still fine. Inflation is dangerous because once it goes above a threshold, then it becomes galloping inflation. In order to stop that, you have to apply the brakes, and usually you go into recession. But this current account deficit is not bad. This rate of inflation is not bad, but the growth is what we are worried about, okay? The growth, this growth, look at 205, 206, 207. That was excellent, excellent. We could do even a bit more, but then the crisis came, and the point is, why, after the crisis, don't we return to those? And that's the crucial thing. That's the crucial question. Is it still that we face a crisis, that we have the remnant effect of the crisis, and therefore we need more stimulus package? A stimulus package means the government spends much more than it takes in. So you have a deficit, and you have a national debt, and you cannot overdo that, because some European countries did, and they got into deep trouble. So, but not only that, if the lack of growth or inadequate growth is due to the recession, then we may make the sacrifice and have more stimulus. South Africa did stimulus, but now it may be more structural, and that's why we'll have to look at the structural cases. This is just the dollar rand. You can go on again, dollar rand. And now notice the problem that the Dean very deeply, and we all know. South Africa unemployment rate. This is the ranking of the nations according from the highest to the lowest unemployment rate. South Africa is an total unemployment rate of almost 25%. It is the 28th nation with the highest rate of unemployment, starting from the highest, and then you go to South Africa here, okay? But look at youth unemployment, 48%, and this is dangerous. You can say, well, in Spain and Greece, not other countries, you have the same rate. Yes, but it's a different situation. They have, they come from families who are well off, who can help. They had jobs and they lost them, or they never got it, but they expect to get it. But we are looking also at perceptions. We want young people to know that there is a possibility of getting jobs. So we don't want to make growth the ultimate, but it is necessary. It is necessary. I was at the General Assembly of the United Nations and talking about globalization, growth, and there was an Indian scientist who was born in the United States, but origin from India, and he said, I went back to the village of my parents. And I was astounded by the fraternity that I found. People knew each other, they helped each other. That's wonderful. But we want to be a bit richer. We all want to be more brotherly and more kind to one another, but not at the level of prehistory. We want to be more of that and have more. So it's almost romanticizing that advanced economies, we lose some of our brotherliness, if the word exists. But we want to be more that, but with a decent standard of living. And this is also income inequality. Now, income inequality today in South Africa is higher than 20 years ago. Now, South Africa, the measure, you cannot compare the measure in South Africa with the measure in other countries because South Africa comes from a different history, and China certainly manufactures data. China, the things that they don't like, they don't want it to be published, and they tell you what the data is. You see, the nation decides what the data is, and then transmits this data to the world. The World Bank then tries to verify whether this is the case. And in China, they don't allow them to verify. So you have to take what China says. For example, in Argentina, Argentina said the rate of inflation is 5%. The World Bank and the IMF went to Argentina and said, no, the rate is not 5, it's not 7, it's not 10, but 15%. You are lying and we will not publish this data. But China does not want this data to be published, okay? So China would be far further up. But inequality, but please understand, that is a delicate matter. Inequality cannot be equal. No nation, you need some inequality in order to induce and stimulate growth. In Europe, a technician earns only 5% less than an engineer. Okay? So there is no reason for people to become engineers. They have to go to school for 2-3 years more, they have more responsibilities and so on. In other words, some inequality is the incentive that makes people do more effort. Lula, former president of Brazil, is not an educator. He does not even have high school education. He was a labor leader and a leftist labor leader. And he asked his economists, we want more growth and more equality. And the economist said, well, you can do some of that, but you cannot overdo it on equality, because otherwise it detracts from growth. In other words, there is a necessary level of inequality. Now, you don't want too much inequality, because that leads to a political instability and so on. So Lula, the uneducated, the left-wing labor leader, asked an intelligent question. Would the poor people be better off if we allow growth to be rapid, with some inequality, in Brazil as a, or if we redistribute everything, we'll be better off? And the answer was clear. The poor people would be much better off if we allow rapid growth, even at the expense of some inequality. But of course, no one can say how much inequality is dangerous and how much is necessary. Each society has to view it within its own context. But then there is this misery index for whatever you want. I mean, people invent, it is you had the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, and you had a misery index. I don't know that we can make much of it. And notice in South Africa, this misery index is primarily made by the high level of unemployment and the remaining, and then little on inflation. In Venezuela is not very much the level of unemployment, but it's much to inflation. But we cannot make much of it. And now, these are the fastest growing economies in the world. 6 of the 10 are nations which are extremely poor, no comparison to South Africa, and it's easy to start growth when you are, and it's Angola, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Chad, Mozambique, and Rwanda. And look at the rates of growth. So now, we do not have a theory of growth that foolproof. In international, we have theories that we know work. In development, in development, we need to understand what is it that is common to these countries. And we go on, and we know more, and we know what are the characteristics of the rapidly growing countries. You need openness. You cannot be closed, okay? You need a market economy. You need a government that gives stability and gives direction and incentives, and our rate of savings and investment. And now comes this in my contribution. Where does South Africa miss? Where are the improvements that are necessary? We have an index of competitiveness. This index is calculated only for 60 countries, because others do not have the data. That's why there is no data to measure this, but if they were, they would do very poorly. So China is 21 out of the 16 countries in the degree of international competitiveness. India is 40, Russia is 42, Brazil is 51, Africa 53, South Africa 53. So that's where we have to improve. And we know what are the conditions to be internationally competitive. In other words, you have to have regulations which do not discourage growth. You cannot overtax profits, otherwise firms move elsewhere. But the ease of doing business, how easy is it to do business in South Africa? Well, South Africa does very well. Out of 180 nations for which this index was done, South Africa is 41. If you realize that 34 countries are the advanced countries which usually are good in this, South Africa does better than most other emerging markets. All of these, of the BRICS, and better than most other out of 189. Now China tried to suppress this measure. Using its power, goes to the World Bank and say, we don't want this measure because they don't come well, and so they don't want the measure, you know. And I was part of it. No. You are strong, you are important, but this is a measure which is useful. You do not dictate the law for others. But look at investments. India, which is a poor country, invests 35% of GDP. South Africa, only 19%. So this is an area where we need to improve. South Africa does extremely well on expenditures in education, but we are not getting the benefit that in other words, we spend a great deal, but looking at, in other words, how do you measure your effort? One is by expenditures, one by results. And the results are much less than we expect for that kind of expenditures. So the question is to go upstream to see why. Are the teachers inadequate? Are the young students who realize that their older brothers or sisters went to college and did not get a job, and therefore they are discouraged from learning because they say there is no benefit that we get? But this is certainly the area. Internet users, infrastructures, corruption, and crime. Now let me say about something, corruption and crime. No nation has a monopoly. Every country has corruption and crime. But there is a threshold. If a nation goes above this threshold, nothing that we do will be helpful for growth. So the threshold depends on the nation. Now, not referring to South Africa, but I'm saying this. Who asked the government official to be in government? No one. They want to be. Why should they want to be? To be helpful, to help the economy. Why do people become doctors or ministers? They don't become doctors or ministers to make money. Society ensures them a good living. But they have to do, it's a calling. You know, a minister does to do. And when a minister does something bad, like for example, sexually abusing a young person, that's much worse than the average person. It's bad enough because we trust the person. We entrust this person with our children, and they use that as, then they should go to jail and the key thrown away. In other words, so we have, when a banker steals, it's bad. It's illegal. But when a minister steals, it's good, because no one asks them to be a minister. He has to be there, a government official, to do good for society. Society allows a good living, not to become rich, otherwise do something else. So corruption, and South Africans know this. People in South Africa know this, for whatever they are demanding that their government officials behave, give an example, and behave, and in order to do what is helpful. Now, the second best is that they don't behave and do things that are good. The worst is they don't do good things and they steal, okay? So now, we could almost live with the government officials who may steal a little but do something good. In some European countries, they used to steal and do good. Now they only steal, so that's not good. So we need to resolve this. So we have the issues. So notice one thing, and we are finishing. Notice one thing. Now, even those of you who are not economists, here we have doing business, the ranking in the world. These are nations in which doing business is easy. It is, you are incentivized to do business, and this is the degree of international competitiveness. Notice the positive relation. Each dot is a country. In other words, the easier it is to do business, you know, to train workers, not to have over-regulations, over-taxation, rule of law, the more internationally competitive you become. Look at the next. Now, here you have globalization. The more you are globalized, the greater the per capita income, the greater the standard of living. Notice an exponential growth. In other words, look where South Africa is right on the line. In other words, global competitiveness is not bad, but not as great as over here, and the per capita income is here. Notice if South Africa was here, it would have to be achieved by increasing international competitiveness and therefore much higher growth. So in a sense, go back 1 minute, So notice, the easier it is to do business, the more competitive we are. Next. Now, the more competitive we are, the more rapidly we grow. And so we want to go back to see what holds back South Africa, not just to say platitudes, we have to invest more. Where do we need to make effort? How much distance we need to cover to catch up to a nation like Korea, which had nothing. Not everybody can be like Korea, but Korea had nothing. On today's standard, Korea's per capita income in 1950 was $500. And Korea is not blessed like South Africa with natural resources. They had nothing. So, of course, in Korea, they do to excesses. To be disciplined is important. But to be over-disciplined, it becomes in Austria, the first time I went, the dean said, I'll pick you up at 6 o'clock. At 5:30, he rang me upstairs, and he said, I'm here. So, well, you said 6 o'clock. At 6 o'clock, I'll come down. 5:45, he rang again. So now I know that when I go to Austria, when they say 6, it means 5:30. Okay? When I go to Italy, I say I want to see something at 6, I'll tell him at 5:30. He comes at 6, he apologizes, I accept the apology, and we are all happy. So, rigidity, discipline is important. The United States is not as disciplined as Germany or Japan, but it has a little flexibility. We don't make discipline the end in and of itself. I mean, can you imagine in Toyota, we began the job, the work day, 20 years ago, exercising together, all the employees, and praying to the company, no, we don't want to do that. I mean, this is slavery. We don't want to do that. So we know what needs to be done, and that's the end. And so, based on the data in the last table, South Africa should be growing faster than it does. And so should Brazil and Russia. The potential rate of growth is 6-7%. Now, are these three nations in what's called the middle income trap? That is, there are countries like Argentina that reach a certain level and then they get stuck. It's like a seaplane that starts moving, and then when it has to take off, it doesn't have that extra push, that extra energy to move out. That's the danger. And Argentina was the seventh richest country in the world in 1938, and it got stuck. We want to know, we don't want South Africa to get stuck at that level, which it is at that level with the per capita income, and we want to know how to be able to take off, and those are the things that we need. More education, that's our career, exactly the things that I've looked at. But again, I don't come here to say we need to invest more. Where are we not doing well? Where do we need improvements? How much improvement? And we hope that this experience will be, we wish South Africa well. And I know that, as I said, you've gone a long, long way. You have people without electricity. It's expensive to provide all of these things, and it's done so in a peaceful way. To say we are all brothers and sisters, it's much. Somebody asked me, what is the vision? What is the view of South Africa in the world? That's an interesting question because the perception is also important. And South Africa is very well. There is a great reputation for South Africa, and not just Mandela. The South Africa, of course, Mandela is a saint. If saints exist, but he is a saint. Okay, but South Africa has gone a long way, and we are all interested that South Africa continues to develop and become in the level of Korea and the other advanced countries. And we wish that this would be soon. Thank you very much.